We have a definite fascination for monarchy as a form of government. Something about the idea of a dynasty lasting ages attracts us. It's probably our lizard brains thinking about the genes getting the wealth, which goes along with government. But this fascination makes this form of government one of the most popular in a fantasy as well. So today, let's talk about monarchy, dynasty, and how you can inherit power in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you like this kind of content and you want to support me in making more of it, you can hit my Ko-fi page or buy my books, both linked down below. And thank you very much to my current Ko-fi providers who help me in keeping this kind of content going. Okay, let's crack on. First, for the purpose of this video, what is a monarchy? I'm defining a monarchy as a system of government where the highest executive position at the very minimum passes from one member of a dynasty to another. Okay, so what's a dynasty? For the purpose of this video, it is a family that holds power, people related by blood. And the reason why I'm being so very cagey with my definitions is because I want to discuss a number of monarchic models in this video. But before I get into the actual specific types of monarchy, let's talk about some of the general attributes of a monarchic government and a monarchic court. First up, any government has backers. Any government has people that they have to keep happy in order to remain in power. These are people who hold the real levers of power, generally something to do with money, generally something to do with resources, and those people have to be kept happy. Whether they're your army generals, whether they're your guilds, whatever the nature of these people. In monarchy, this is also applicable. This is where you have special interest groups, even in a monarchy, that have to be kept happy. No dictator is truly a dictator, like a solo absolute dictator. You could perhaps have that in a fantasy world where you have a mage who is capable of personally maintaining power, but then you're looking at something like a god king who can be everywhere all at once, and that makes for a very hard story because how do you resist such an omnipotent power, or how do you write this conflict about such an omnipotent power? So generally speaking, all rulers require some kind of support structure around them. So how do you keep these people happy? This is where networks of patronage come in. This is where things happen like the king gives land rights. The king gives monopoly power over resources. In a fantasy world, the king could give monopoly power over magic. He could give the right to create magic school, the right to hire mages. There could be all kinds of implications that the king gives as a patronage system. The most apt demonstration of this comes from Dune, and this is where the emperor gave House Atreides the monopoly over the spice trade, removing that patronage from the Harkonnens. Now, of course, we know that that was actually a poison pill that the monarch was giving to House Atreides, but it is nonetheless a very relevant demonstration of that kind of patronage network in action. In a sci-fi world, you could even go in a much more metaphysical direction. So you could say that in a sci-fi world, you could gain the right to mine data, and data could be your central form of currency. So the king holds the keys to the data vaults, and he gives people the right to access that data and build products and advertising and whatever else based on how much he values them. This kind of patronage network is also where sumptuary laws come in, where the laws of what you're allowed to wear come in, because the king could grant people specific permission to wear certain kinds of cloth or to wear certain kinds of gems. And these things amount to people's status. And if you've ever played a RPG game where dice are a vanity item, you know that playing on people's vanity in that way is a very relevant way of getting them to do things, getting them to spend more, getting them to support you as king. I did do an entire video on sumptuary laws, and you can check that out in the information card. It's not just your backers that you have to worry about in government. You also have to worry about the people. Now, how much you have to worry about the people depends largely on your economy. If your economy is a primary resource one, so a mining one where you primarily get your wealth by mining it out of the ground, or some such not so very skilled labor requirement economy, an economy based on unskilled labor, you don't have to keep your people as happy, because you can always just replace workers by putting more workers into the salt mines. You can enslave more people and drive them down into the mines, and that keeps your economy running. It makes you a brutal dictator, but you can run your economy like that. But if your economy is a more skills-based economy, if you've moved to the point where you have merchants and skilled craftsmen and traders and so forth, then the people do need to be kept happy. But this doesn't mean that all people need to be kept equally happy. You see, this is where you start dividing people up into blocks, and you keep the young people happy, or you keep the traders happy, or you keep the crafts guilds happy, or you keep the assassins guild happy. Whatever the most influential part of your society is, whatever the most influential block of your society is, that's who you keep happy. And I did do a video on merchant guilds and crafts guilds, which you can check out in the information cards. Okay, so that's backers and normal people. What else does the king have to do to stay in power? He has to flex. I've spoken about this before. It is critically important in a monarchical system that you flex your power, that you show why you should continue to be in power. And this means projecting your power. And ultimately, that comes down to an efficient form of communication or a means to visit people. Communication allows you to project power from afar. It allows you to communicate to forces loyal to you that will carry out that projection of power on your behalf. And you can see that in the postal system of Cyrus the Great, who was one of the most celebrated emperors of the Persian Empire, and he had an excellent communication method, and that's how he kept the empire together. You can also see it in the way that Brandon Sanderson uses span reeds in Stormlight Archives, where he uses span reeds to project power and to communicate across long distances and keep the alliances together. I did do a video on fantasy communications, which you can check out in the information card. Look, this is going to be a refrain throughout this video. Monarchy is a massive topic. Government is a massive topic. So there just is not enough time in a single video to cover it all. A lot of these elements I have covered before, and I'll put links to all those videos in the description so that you can go delve into the specific elements that you want to go hit. Okay, back to projecting power. Royal courts. So royal courts are going to have a lot of ritualized aspects to them. They're going to have means by which the emperor or the king projects power. And you can see that in the way that the Chinese worked with their tributary states. So a tributary king of the Chinese emperor had to come and kowtow to the emperor, which is a very specific bow down to their knees with their face down. That is basically to show how far above them the emperor is and how far below him these tributary kings are. So you need to give some thought to the kind of communication, rituals, and etiquette of your fantasy court. And I did do a video about it. This is an iceberg, man. There's a lot going on below the surface of the monarchy that has the king on the top. So check out my video on courts and rituals around court building. But You can also project power differently from communications. You can have an itinerant court. You can have a court that travels between the nobles of your kingdom or between the kingdoms of your empire. This is what the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI did in the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but regardless. He traveled from prince to prince in the domain, basically making them give him hospitality in each city. And this then resulted in him knowing what was going on in that city, communicating directly with his nobles, and thus maintaining his power. But that kind of itinerant court is actually really awkward. It means the king doesn't have a single place to call home. It means he can be difficult to reach. So the alternative from having a traveling court is to have people that you call friends, people that the king trusts, appointed to positions of power to represent the king in those areas. And of course, this gives you an immense scope for plot. What if those people aren't trustworthy? What if they were trustworthy, but then they become flipped? Remember that those people also have patronage networks to maintain. So what if the king isn't generous enough and they need him to be more generous, but he won't be, so they turn to his enemies instead? So that kind of network of trust rolling down through the kingdom is a very, very interesting way of playing with your royalty in terms of a distributed kingdom. So that's monarchy in general, and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed that discussion. And let's talk about some of those specific models of monarchy. So the first model is successive monarchy. So this is very simply the normal one that we know. So it's the classic. You get inheritance through your birthright. Most of us know the model of primogeniture, which is where the eldest son inherits the title and everything that goes with it, but it's not the only model. In the East, there have been models where it is the youngest child that inherits the title and becomes the king or the monarch or the ruler. You can also do inheritance through the female line, where it is the king's nephew or the king's niece who will inherit the title. And I know, I'm sounding like a broken record. I did a video on inheritance models, which you can check out in the information card. Okay, so that's straight up inheritance. But how does that kind of monarchy come into being? So in our world, it was generally speaking a warrior who got that started. So a warrior would take control of a piece of land, and then over generations, his family would build up wealth in that piece of land. But in your world, in a magical world, it can be almost anything. It can be that they took control of a piece of magic. It can be that they are divinely blessed by a god and they hold that god's mandate. It could be that they're a charlatan who claim to hold a god's mandate, but in point of fact, they're actually just a mage. So you are really in a position where you can go with almost anything here. Just make sure that you give the original starting point control over some kind of very, very important resource. So what I did in my world is I gave the original emperor control over the most powerful form of magic practiced in my world, which is Dusang. And it is an externally manifesting magic that includes things like turning your body into fire, or using fire as a weapon, or traveling through the shadows, or inflicting a cut on someone and ripping their entire stock of blood through that cut. So these are powerful magics, and I gave that to the starting emperor, and that's the patronage that he used to get the other kingdoms on his side and unite the empire. So just think about what would be a great resource in your world and then give that to your starting dude. Okay, so if you like that discussion about successive monarchies, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about elective monarchies. So from our world, the Celtic kings are a good example of this. The ruler was elected from a given member of a family. Any freeborn member of that family was eligible for the election, given that both father and grandfather had been noble and that he was free from all deformities or blemishes. If there were several candidates, a court was held for the election in the house of the chief ostler of the district. Sometimes an heir was chosen while the current king was alive by the election process in order to avoid disputes and to give the heir time to gain some knowledge based around this. Now, the problem with elective forms of monarchy is they will almost certainly become a kind of rubber stamping process, because once you've elected a king to power, they basically have the capacity to grow their wealth. And that growth of wealth allows them to stay in power without variation. And a great example of this comes from Catherine Kerr's world. Now, as I've said previously, Catherine Kerr drew heavily on Celtic mythology. So she did have a council of electors, but they only became relevant if the king had no direct heirs, or if the nobleman had no direct heirs, and the council of electors had to vote to put an heir on the throne. She did a great storyline about this, where one of the very, very important nobles died without an heir. And the council of electors actually went into rebellion against the king and tried to break away from the kingdom and to establish their own kingdom. And what happened in the end was the king put down the rebellion, and there was one noble who'd stayed loyal to the king. And the king then went to him and said, look, these other guys are all traitors, so they can't be they can't be electors. It's only you and me on the council of electors. And I say you're, now the main dude in this province. And that was how the province became the property of the Canobian family. So it's a very, very interesting and dynamic model to play with, where you have partial elections based on a selective criteria. And if you like that discussion of elective monarchy, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about skilled monarchs. So with a skilled monarch, the monarch needs to achieve something. This is half of the model that I use. The other half is inheritance. But the half that I use is that every monarch, every high noble, must have the ability to manifest this magic that I spoke of at the beginning, Dusang magic. So what this gives you is it gives you a monarchic system where the king or the nobles must display a minimum level of competence in some skill. And it can be anything. It can be exams like the Confucius bureaucracy exams that were implemented in China. It can be martial skills. It can be magical skills. But they need to have some minimum level of skill. The example that I really want to delve into here is actually from Legend of the Five Rings, which is a role-playing world that I'm particularly fond of, a Far Eastern role-playing world. And here there is a position called the Emerald Champion. Now, the Emerald Champion isn't the emperor exactly, but he speaks with the emperor's voice, so, close enough. And the Emerald Champion is decided with the Emerald Championship. So this is a contest where the nominees participate against each other in etiquette, investigation, law, leadership, resources, and martial ability. They then get points from all of these, and they take those points with them into the final contest, which is an Iajitsu duel, a one-strike duel. So what this gives you is it gives you an extremely competent individual that is running your government, somebody who is potentially personally very powerful, as well as wielding political power. And that kind of interplay is always fun, because as a monarch, you can't really go out and do stuff yourself, right? Because you can't leave the throne unattended. But at the same time, the monarch is this extremely competent, capable individual. So there's the temptation to go out and do it yourself. But if you do that, who says the throne's going to be waiting for you when you come back? So that to me is always an interesting model to play with, that kind of skilled individual. And if you like that discussion of skilled monarchs, hit the thumbs up button. And let's discuss some complications of a monarchic system. So when I spoke about the Emerald Champion, I said that he might as well be the emperor. And this is always an interesting thing. What if your monarch is a smokescreen? What if they don't actually hold power? And you could see this in Japan. The emperor did not hold power for large parts of his reign. The power was held by the shogun, or after the shogunate was overthrown, the power was held by the rich merchants and the rich business people. The emperor had almost no real power. So in that case, you've got a very interesting dictomony where the emperor remains this pure thing, but he has no power. And you can see that also in Avatar: The Last Airbender in the Earth Kingdom. Nominally, the king with his bear Bosco has power, but he doesn't. All of the power resides with the Earth bureaucracy. And that always makes for a very interesting, very kind of underhanded court with this smokescreen emperor and then these, conniving eunuchs or these conniving bureaucrats or the shogun or whatever you want to play with in terms of who actually really holds power. Then, of course, there can be limitations on power. You can have a constitution that limits the power of the emperor by means of either written law or understood law. So I did that in my world, where I have what is called the Great Bargain, which is a deal struck between the nobles, the magic users, and the law keepers who basically control the bulk of the peasant population, the bulk of the people. And they struck a deal to share power, and that's why the empire still continues to exist. So there are limits on imperial power. If you don't have limits on power, you might end up in a situation where the king is being ripped apart between different powers, like what happened in France when Louis might have wanted to give the peasants some rights, but his nobles and the clergy wouldn't let him, and in the end he carried the can for that. And if you want my views on revolution and reform, I did a video on that. You can check it out in the information card. What happens when monarchies go bad? On the topic of people losing things, the Chinese model with a mandate of heaven is particularly interesting in this regard, because the Chinese emperor held the mandate of heaven until he didn't, until he was successfully overthrown. And if the emperor was successfully overthrown and a new dynasty took over, they then clearly had the mandate of heaven because they won. So it's a very interesting take on it. But what I find really interesting about that model is it illustrates so clearly that the personality of the emperor didn't really matter, because you were judged to be in danger of losing the mandate of heaven if there were natural disasters. So the king could be fantastic. It could be a great emperor. He could, for some reason, be really an enlightened dude who's taking his people places. And then there's an earthquake followed by a volcano. And people are like, no, you've lost the mandate of heaven. And suddenly he's got rebellions jumping up everywhere. And if he can't put out those fires, he loses. Despite the fact that he's a good emperor, sorry, you're gone, because there was an earthquake. So it shows that the personality of the ruler matters less than you think it does in terms of whether a dynasty holds on to power. It is about what the people believe about the monarch. Does he have the right to rule? And if you like that discussion about the complications of monarchy, hit the thumbs up button. So when you're building a monarchy in this huge iceberg, what do you really need to think about? Because I've touched on a lot. Okay, you need a succession model. You need to pick one of those succession models and go with it. You need to understand what economics the kingdom rests on and how does that affect the state of the people. Are they workers in a gold mine, Or is this a more services-based economy that then comes with the power of merchants and craft guilds? What is the monarch's resources? What can they offer as patronage to those whose support they need? Land, magic, data, whatever it is, it needs to be something valued by society. What is the actual royal court like? What rituals exist in it? How does it flex power? And finally, what threatens the monarch and how can a dynasty be overthrown and replaced? And those are my thoughts on monarchy in a fantasy government. If you like this video, maybe check out my video on general models of government in fantasy worlds. And if you want to connect around this topic or any other topic, I do have a Discord server linked down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.